We are back on CBS Sports HQ taking a look at the most recent iteration of the college football playoff rankings, and we have some movement. Boomer Sooner making their way into the top 10, moving up a spot to number 10. Cincinnati dropping a spot despite being undefeated and out of action a week ago from 8 down to 9. Florida, after their big loss to LSU, drops from 6 to 7. They trade spots with Iowa State now occupying that 6th spot. But 1 through 5, copy them, paste them. It's your college football playoff. Back in the fold with our guys with their immediate reaction to the latest round of college football rankings. Jerry Palm, Chip Patterson weighing in, and as expected, no changes 1 through 5. Before we get to talking about conference title matchups, we do have to address that 6th seed now occupied by Iowa State. And gentlemen, while it doesn't immediately affect the playoff picture, we are talking about major New Year's Day implications. Chip, did the committee get it right in slotting Iowa State at 6?
I think so. The committee's got a really tough decision to make, at least in terms of what it's going to do with everything after Texas A&M, because there certainly seems to be a very short list of actual contenders to make it, and the committee's primary job is to pick the top 4 teams. Iowa State, the distance between the Cyclones and Texas A&M in the committee's eyes are probably a lot farther than the distance between numbers 5 and number 6. But I think that if you're going to drop Florida, then Iowa State's going to move up. Iowa State didn't play, Cincinnati didn't play. Cincinnati actually moved down. The big thing that stands out to me is that Florida had a very, very, very short fall after an embarrassing loss as a 24-point favorite. And Jerry Palm mentioned at the top of the hour that the win against Georgia was going to give Florida a very high floor. But the love for Georgia and the love for Florida, it certainly seems like for an Oklahoma, for example, who is playing Iowa State this weekend in the Big 12 championship game, man, it certainly seems like that's a long way to go. So I don't love the adjustment with Florida so far, but all in all, I think Iowa State moving up, given the lack of action with Iowa State and Cincinnati, I think that it makes sense.
Yeah, Jerry, you did call your shot a little earlier here in the rankings 1 through 6. Your most recent reaction here to this most recent round of rankings is what?
Well, I was a little surprised that Georgia moved past Cincinnati. I mean, yes, they beat Missouri, who was in the rankings but shouldn't have been, and they beat them pretty soundly. And Cincinnati, is out of sight, out of mind right now, and that was considered a pretty good win for Georgia. It might even be their best win so far. So, for Georgia to move up, I mean, I'm not comfortable with Georgia where they are. I haven't been the entire time. But if you're going to compare them to, they've got a good win last week. Cincinnati didn't do anything. I guess I could see them move up. And Florida really only dropped 1 spot with Iowa State jumping them. But that makes sense. Iowa State should be there. So if you're going to put Georgia over Cincinnati, then what we've got in the top 10 is good. But, one thing that stands out for me that's been standing out now for a couple of weeks is Indiana sitting there at 11. Indiana's just got the 1 loss to Ohio State, 7-point loss on the road to Ohio State, and just can't get any traction, and in part because they haven't been able to play the last 2 weeks. They missed out on the Purdue game the first time. The league gave them Purdue again, and both teams have COVID problems, so they couldn't get it done. But Indiana really missed out on a chance to play a team like Iowa, which is who they should have been playing this week. But, they can't. If you can't play, you can't play, and it might keep Indiana out of a New Year's Six game.
Great call, Jerry, because I was trying to think off the top of my head, who would I put Florida on the field against that I think that it would be revealed that perhaps the fall should be more? And I think the answer is Indiana. They might combine for 111 points, but I do think that even with Jack Tuttle at quarterback, those wide receivers would be able to dice up Florida's defense. And I think that Indiana and Florida are a lot closer than they're really being treated by the committee. But again, the committee is just putting so much weight on that head-to-head win against Georgia, and it is all in on Georgia having turned the corner offensively after JT Daniels has come in. And so Indiana is really finding itself in a tough position, because as we are starting to get New Year's Six bowls assigned, the fact that they are still just getting held down by that Florida-Georgia combination has got to be really frustrating for the Hoosiers.
Well, the focus will remain on the top half of this top 10, and number 6 Iowa State and the rest of the back half of the top 10 going to have to wait for the chips to fall on conference championship weekend. The highly anticipated Notre Dame Clemson rematch going to come to pass Saturday in Chip's neck of the woods. Offense was not Clemson's issue in round 1, but they will have potential first overall pick Trevor Lawrence back in the fold. This time, Chip, who are you giving the edge in this spot?
I'm going to give it to Clemson. I will say that the place that you can look at this game, and you might be able to tell it early in terms of whether or not Notre Dame's going to be able to hang in here and potentially beat Clemson for a second time, it's going to be whether or not Clemson can get the rush game going. Travis Etienne has had 6 straight games under 100 yards rushing. And in that game against Notre Dame, Travis Etienne had only 26 rushing yards on 18 attempts. And so if Clemson's offensive line gets pushed around in the trenches, kind of like it did in that loss to Notre Dame, then maybe the Fighting Irish are going to be able to do it. Now, granted, I do think there is an X factor of Trevor Lawrence. You can't say that it's necessarily in the statistics because DJ Uiagalelei had about 1,000 yards in Notre Dame Stadium. But I think that the ability to be able to make plays and to be 33-1 as a starter, you've won a national championship, you played for a national championship. Trevor Lawrence is worth some points on this spread right now, but the game will be decided in whether or not Notre Dame can stop Clemson's rushing attack, because if it can, I think it's a little bit of an equalizer.
And Jerry, we have been looking forward to this matchup since the final whistle blew in round 1. I've asked you to do it each of the last 3 weeks, but take us through the outcomes here and the potential playoff implications.
Sure. So for Notre Dame, if they win, they've got a chance to be the overall #1 seed, but they need Alabama to lose. That seems pretty unlikely, but certainly they'd be no worse than 2. But I believe Notre Dame is in the playoff regardless. Even if they lose, I don't see how Notre Dame falls below a Texas A&M team that doesn't have a win the quality of what Notre Dame has right now. And so I think Notre Dame is a playoff team no matter what. I think they could even get beat pretty soundly and still be a playoff team. But Chip, I agree with you in terms of Clemson running the ball, but Clemson also has to stop Notre Dame from running the ball. They were really hurt on defense in that game. They were missing some guys, the linebackers. They're healthy on defense. Clemson's defense has got to step up and hold that Notre Dame offense down a bit more than they did.
All right, guys, in the Big Ten, it's going to be Ohio State and Northwestern. This one appears lopsided from just about every angle, but they don't play them on paper. For the Buckeyes, it's simple. Win and you're in. They're in that 4 spot right now. But, Jerry, how do we go about making sense of a potential 7-1 conference champion Northwestern team with a win over Ohio State?
Well, I mean, what a great season it's been for Northwestern regardless. But if they actually beat Ohio State, they're not going to jump up into playoff contention, because I think it would reflect more badly on Ohio State than it does good on Northwestern. But Northwestern is definitely going to be a top 10 team if that happens, maybe as high as 8, ahead of Georgia, who's not going to play. And it would be hard to deny Northwestern a ranking that high. They'd be in the Fiesta Bowl against probably USC or whoever comes out of the Pac-12. And it's a fantastic season for Northwestern. And Pat Fitzgerald is the best coach in that league, and he shows it every single year just by getting to this point. And if he gives Ohio State a game, it's a tremendous effort by Northwestern.
Oh, man, I love this matchup because I think it is a great test for Justin Fields, because right now, Justin Fields, a lot of times it feels like he's holding this Ohio State offense together with his ability to extend the play with his legs, take off running, or be the main rusher in a designed run situation. And I want to see him squeeze some tough throws in against the #1 pass efficiency defense in the Big Ten, that is Northwestern. Northwestern is, we know, great defensively, but in particular that secondary, I think that they are just not going to be intimidated by the talent advantage that Garrett Wilson and the rest of those Ohio State wide receivers present to so many of the opponents that the Buckeyes face. So can Justin Fields make some tough throws? Can he be able to lead that team down the field? Because if it turns into a ground and pound game that favors Northwestern, yes, I would still pick Ohio State to win because Justin Fields is that kind of difference maker. But, Master Teague running the ball, Trey Sermon running the ball, that Ohio State offensive line that has had lapses at times where they've been a little bit overwhelmed in the trenches. This is going to be a very, very physical Northwestern front that is going to try to put Ohio State in 3rd and long situations and let its secondary win battles. I think that's going to be something fascinating to watch. Because look, Northwestern's offense is not fantastic. If it's low scoring, then it's interesting. If Ohio State puts up a couple tutties quick, well, then it could be over quick.
That is number 14 versus number 4 for the Big Ten title. Texas A&M, meanwhile, they've spent the last 4 weeks in the ballroom, but not on the dance floor, let's say. Number 5 going to play Tennessee this weekend. Just as another data point, I guess. Chip, what has to happen here for the Aggies to realize their ultimate goal of finding their way into that top 4?
I think that Texas A&M needs to win, and I'm not sure if it needs to win convincingly, because it kind of feels like this Texas A&M Tennessee game is a little bit of a tree falls in the woods situation, where the selection committee will be so focused on the action in so many other places that it just needs to be a check the box kind of win to make sure that you're showing up on Selection Sunday with 1 loss. Now, what does Texas A&M want to root for? Texas A&M wants to root for Northwestern to win. Texas A&M wants to root for Notre Dame to beat Clemson. Texas A&M wants to make sure that Alabama beats Florida. I mean, they get to sit around and just hope for chaos. And I think that's Texas A&M's best argument, is just to be there and just to accidentally get the invitation. I mean, so many times I've been a late invite to a fancy dinner. You know, the name tag is different. They'll scratch it out. Like, sorry, Texas A&M, I know your name tag says Ohio State, but Ohio State blew it against Northwestern. We'll scratch that out and we'll put Texas A&M, and Texas A&M will be happy to be there. And I think that is the key. You don't need style points. You just need to have 1 loss on Selection Sunday and hope for some chaos elsewhere.
Chip, just know that you're always at the top of the list for Joe Musso's dinner parties, all right? It'll happen.
Thanks, Joe.
We'll get it done. Your small table type circle, all right? Last chance to put it out there before the playoff is set. That's coming on Sunday. Jerry Palm, I need your final playoff prediction as we get ready for conference championship weekend in college football.
Well, it's the same one I've had since Oregon lost. Alabama 1, Clemson 2, Ohio State 3, and Notre Dame 4, based on, of course, Clemson beating Notre Dame this weekend.
Ditto. Copy and paste. Alabama 1, Clemson 2, Ohio State 3, and Notre Dame at 4, based on Clemson beating Notre Dame. And I'll tell you what, we will get into a situation where I think the College Football Playoff Selection Committee is going to be asked to play a little bit of television executive, because if the seeding needs to be tweaked so that we don't have a Clemson Notre Dame round 3 in the semifinals, then I think the seeding will be tweaked.
Sign me up for round 3 or the Irish yet, too. Still plenty to figure out here, even with what we know about these top 4 teams. Gentlemen, thank you for the insights as always. All right, here's a look at the final college football playoff rankings predictions. Same for both of our guys. Jerry Palm, Chip Patterson, both see it as Bama 1, Clemson 2, Ohio State 3, Notre Dame 4. That all is barring a Notre Dame loss to Clemson in the ACC title game, which means it would be Bama Notre Dame, Clemson Ohio State in the college football playoff. Coming up, it's trophy time in the college ranks, but the Blue Bloods ain't the only winners. We got expert picks to help you find a weekend winner. It's all coming next on HQ. Back on HQ, taking a look at some notable matchups for the weekend ahead. But folks, they're all notable when we got hardware on the line. It all begins on Friday in the Pac-12. Oregon playing an interim role here, taking on USC in that game. Was supposed to be Washington, but some COVID issues in the Huskies program puts the Ducks in the title game. Northwestern and Ohio State going to battle on Saturday in the Big Ten Championship in Indy. Iowa State, now at number 6, will take on Oklahoma for the Big 12 Championship. Notre Dame in their maiden voyage in the ACC trying to claim the title against Clemson, Part 2. Florida and Alabama, the SEC title game, Saturday on CBS. All right, let's put some picks to it with the QB room. CBS Sports football analyst Brady Quinn and Danny Cannell joining us now. Fellas, let's start with the SEC. Alabama has not had a game decided by less than 15 points this season. It's cruise control meets a cruise missile. They're laying quite a palatable 17 points here to Florida. Florida coming fresh off that loss to LSU. Total sitting at 74.5. Danny, how are you approaching this one?
I think Bama's going to blow them out. I really do. I mean, Florida, I think, has been playing with fire all season long with a defense that's been suspect. And then they finally got burned by LSU this past weekend playing at home. Bama is in another stratosphere when you look at them compared even against Ohio State and Clemson and Notre Dame, the other teams that are in the top 4. So I would expect Bama to run away with this one. I don't think Florida, I think they'll be able to score some points on them. Obviously, the odds makers do with that total set so high, but Bama will just keep scoring on them. And I think ultimately when it comes down to it, Bama's going to run away with it. So I would lay the points with Alabama and say it's probably not that close. Probably the game, I think, in the second quarter is a 2-touchdown for lead from Bama. I don't think they look back.
You're going to hear a lot of chalk from me talking about these conference championship games. I just think that the better teams in college football have separated themselves from the rest, and it's going to show out in particular in the SEC championship game. The only wild card here is Kyle Pitts will be back for Florida. They didn't have him versus LSU. He warmed up, didn't end up going in that game. He's arguably the most dominant tight end / pass catcher in the country, probably next to Devonta Smith for Alabama. So it should be fun to watch both these players. However, even though Florida might be able to keep pace with the offense of Alabama, I just don't see their defense being able to get enough stops. And Alabama's, on the other hand, it should be able to get Trask either off the field on third down or a couple of turnovers, as we saw last week versus LSU. So this one, to me, is probably going to be more about who ends up winning the Heisman. You might be picking between Devonta Smith and Mac Jones if it's Alabama winning by the margin that I think they're going to win. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think we should give it to the wide receiver. Like, this young man has been the most dominant player in college football this year at his position. So Bama wins, they roll, they'll be number 1 in the college football playoff.
It was the punt return last week for me. Had nothing to do with his quarterback. Caught the thing, took it to the other end of the field for 6, letting everybody know that he is the weapon that he is. You can catch all that action beginning at 8 Eastern on CBS. We're going to get you set right here pregame on HQ. Meanwhile, in the ACC, it's going to be a rematch of the undefeated Irish and the Clemson Tigers. We got an 87-point overtime thriller that went the way of the Irish back on November 7th. Nonetheless, Vegas sees Clemson as a 2-score favorite in this one. 10.5 is the number, 60 is the total. Brady, I know sports betting has catapulted into the mainstream since your playing days, but if you're in that Irish locker room and you see 10.5 points of disrespect from a team that you beat 6 weeks ago, that's got to be bulletin board material, is it not?
Oh, you better believe. I mean, they're going to feel disrespected by this. And I'll go to this. Everyone keeps talking about Trevor Lawrence wasn't playing, and he's going to come in and save the day. All right, well, what's the over-under on how many yards he's going to throw for? DJ Uiagalelei threw for over 400 yards and a couple touchdowns in the game versus Notre Dame. The quarterback play wasn't the problem. It was the fact they couldn't run the football, and credit defensive coordinator Clark Lee and the Notre Dame defense for stopping Travis Etienne, and give credit to Ian Book and the Notre Dame offense for controlling the game and doing their part and being able to win that matchup. So I love Notre Dame in this spot. I'll gladly take the points in this one. It's hard to beat a team twice, but again, I don't know that they're going to be able to do what they think they're going to do just because Trevor Lawrence is back. Unless he plays a huge part of this rushing attack and he's more of a running threat along with Etienne than what we saw from DJ Uiagalelei, I don't necessarily feel like Notre Dame's going to have that much trouble with him. The only wild card for me in this one, DK, is if you go back to the last matchup, there were some defensive players out. Skalski at linebacker, Davis on the defensive front. And for Notre Dame, they had their starting center, Patterson. He'll be out for this one. It'll either be Josh Lugg or Zeke Corral, and either one, it'll be the first start against that front with a better player at the defensive tackle spot. So that's the area I'm most concerned by if I'm a Notre Dame fan.
Totally agree, Brady. I look at this one too, and I think there's going to be so much focus on the return of Trevor Lawrence, but it should be on those Clemson defenders that were out for that game. I mean, they gave up 47 points. Ian Book had over 310 yards. Kyron Williams went over for 140. They had their way. They were able to impose their will against the Clemson defense that was battered and bruised. Now Clemson getting to full strength at just the right time. But I'm with you. I love Notre Dame in this spot, getting 10.5 points in a championship game. And this is where I think that this hurts Clemson, and it hurt Clemson last year that they don't get battle tested enough. They've been so good, and their schedule has been so diluted against the weaker portion of the ACC that they really haven't gotten tested. And their one most impressive win against the Miami Hurricanes all of a sudden doesn't look quite as great when North Carolina just rushed for 500 yards against that defense. So I don't think Clemson's as battle tested. They've been impressive. The only thing they can do is win the games on their schedule. Meanwhile, Notre Dame beat Clemson. Notre Dame handled North Carolina on the road in Chapel Hill and pitched a goose egg in the second half of that game. I think Notre Dame is more battle tested. I think they're a little bit more physical than Clemson. So I love Notre Dame with the points here, and I don't even mind if you wanted to say Notre Dame won the game outright. I think there's something to be said about Clemson's been there so many times. Notre Dame feels like, hey, no one's giving us credit for that first win. I wouldn't be so shocked at all if Notre Dame won outright.
Love a money line sprinkle in that spot. An undefeated team coming into a matchup for the second time this season. After some massaging of conference-imposed rules, Ohio State going to take on Northwestern in the Big Ten title game. The Buckeyes are 20.5-point favorites. And Danny, I know we perceive these teams as being on completely different levels. That's all well and good. But the Buckeyes are going to enter this matchup, speaking about battle-tested, not having played in the last 14 days. And it's going to be the most stout defense they've seen all season. Any worry when it comes to the number here?
No, it won't matter. Lay the points and don't even think about it. Ohio State is truly one of the, it's the most talented team in the Big Ten by far, and they're one of the most talented teams in the country, which is where the committee has had no problem only seeing 5 games and saying, yep, they look the part. Justin Fields is back. Now, I do think they're susceptible in the secondary to big pass plays as they showcased that against Indiana, but that's not what Northwestern can do. With Peyton Ramsey, they don't exactly have a prolific passing attack that could take advantage of some of the weaknesses in Ohio State's defense. So I think Ohio State will control this game. I think this game will be an easy win for Ohio State, a final tune-up, and I think it's unfair. It's a competitive advantage that Ohio State will only have played 6 games, and they're stacked up against teams, and they will face a team in the playoff that has played 10, 11, and in some cases 12 games. It is absolutely, the freshness factor comes in. Their players will be healthier. They haven't had to run that gauntlet that everybody else has, and that unfair advantage plays significantly in their favor. But I think this is just a final tune-up for the playoff for them. It's almost an exhibition. I think they win handily.
I'm with you, DK. I mean, I think they look like the best, one of the top 4 teams in the country. The problem is their resume is not going to show it. And as evidence of that, when you talk about the disparity between them playing 6 games and being a Big Ten champion getting in, and some teams playing 11 games, look what happened to Florida last week versus LSU. They were a double-digit favorite at home, and they dropped that game. So that's why these games matter. That's why you got to play them out to see what happens. And it's not like Ohio State hasn't stumbled as double-digit favorites versus Iowa, versus Purdue in the past during the course of regular season play. So I can understand people's gripe with this Ohio State team. However, they will take care of business versus Northwestern. This is just a bad matchup for Northwestern. If you look at the strength of this Ohio State defense, it's their front 7. They're actually pretty good against the run. And that's what Northwestern wants to do. Whether it's their stable of running backs or even Peyton Ramsey adding to it, they like to control the game, shorten the game, run the football, don't turn it over, and see if you can out-tough them and win the battle at the line of scrimmage. And then on the flip side, this is a bend but don't break defense, but it's going to break when you look at the strength of Ohio State's offense is their wide receivers. Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, they're deep at that position. We know Fields can get him the football. So this, unfortunately, should be a big win for Ohio State. Like Danny said, lay the points. Don't even think about it. And you mentioned those stats about Northwestern's stingy defense. The reality is they haven't faced a top 40 scoring offense this season. Of the 7 games they've played, 5 of those teams are in the bottom 5 in scoring in Big Ten. So bottom line is their schedule has been a bit of a cakewalk so far this year to prop up their defense the way it has.
Perhaps we will not find out who the real Buckeyes are until New Year's Day. All right, gentlemen, you have imparted your wisdom throughout this ever-changing college football season. We can't thank you enough, but let's make it official. Brady, your final college football playoff rankings look like what?
Alabama number 1, Notre Dame number 2, Ohio State, and Clemson. Something's telling me Clemson's still going to get in with the loss by Florida. I don't see them upsetting Alabama. And I actually think they might give Clemson the benefit of the doubt, not having Trevor Lawrence for that first loss to Notre Dame. And if this one's close, and I do think the Irish will win, I think they might still keep them in as one of the top 4 teams. Let's not forget, too, with this most recent college football ranking, the ACC is the Power 5 conference that has the most teams. So clearly, they think this is a solid conference, maybe a deeper conference than every other conference within the Power 5. So those are my 4 teams.
All right, Brady, I'm going to shake things up a little bit because we saw a little bit of chaos last week, right? Florida getting beat by LSU. I think there's a chance, and you heard me when we were previewing the Notre Dame-Clemson game, that Notre Dame wins the game outright, and I think that would be devastating to Clemson's hopes. Now, granted, if it's a wild, crazy finish, overtime like the last time, maybe they get Clemson-Notre Dame Part 3. But we also know the committee loves the ACC, but, man, they are infatuated with the SEC. And if you saw Notre Dame win, I think that would open up the door for Texas A&M as a one-loss SEC team to come into play, and their only loss being to Alabama. They would have beaten Florida, and their resume isn't fantastic, but they're sitting there at that 5th spot. I think they would bump right in. I wouldn't love it. I would rather see Cincinnati. I would rather see Coastal Carolina. I would love to see even a 2-loss conference champion as opposed to somebody who didn't even win their division, but we know how this works. I think Texas A&M would get the advantage there. So my 4 a little bit different, assuming that Clemson gets bounced from Notre Dame.
DK, you're gonna give those Coastal boys Alabama after what they've accomplished this season. You're gonna give them. I'm sure they'd love a playoff, some playoff implications here, but it would be a tough matchup for the Chanticleers. There are a couple other conferences going off with conference championships this weekend as well. The Big 12, the Pac-12, they become afterthoughts because slim to no playoff implications, but still plenty to play for here. Taking a look at the Big 12, Boomer Sooner going off as 5.5-point favorite Saturday against Iowa State. Iowa State getting that bump in the most recent rankings. Danny, who do we like here?
So I don't love this matchup. I feel like I haven't seen Oklahoma play in forever. And for that reason, I'm going to take Iowa State as the underdog in this championship game. I think this game will be close. I think it might be one of the more entertaining games of the weekend. Matt Campbell as an underdog has a really impressive record of being able to not only cover this point spread, but to be able to win the games outright. And I'm just very curious. If Oklahoma plays at their best, I think they're the most talented team in the Big 12, and they probably win handily. But the fact that they could be a little bit rusty has me concerned. Iowa State's really coming in some momentum off that Texas win, which they won. They absolutely manhandled West Virginia 45-6. They're playing at an all-time confidence level, and they've beaten this team already. So I'm going to take Iowa State in the points, but I don't love this bet. This game I probably feel the most uncertain about of all the championship games this weekend.
I'm on the other side of this one. Look, bottom line is the last time these two teams played, drastically different scenario for where Oklahoma is now. Their defense is remarkably improved from where they were. They should be able to stop the rushing attack of Breece Hall. Spencer Rattler, ever since he got benched and came in the second half versus Texas, has been playing much better football. And the young pieces out around him, whether it's Weiss or Mims or Stogner, all those guys have emerged. Ramondre Stevenson comes back. Once he gets in the backfield, now they've got that hammer, that battering ram in the backfield to add with their stable of backs. And then I talked about the defense. How about Ronnie Perkins? Since he joined off suspension, this is an entirely different group up front. Iowa State didn't see him or Stevenson the first time around, and it's going to be a big difference in this one. So I'll gladly lay the 5.5 points. I think Oklahoma wins. The problem is, as a 2-loss Big 12 champion at number 10 right now in the polls, they most likely can't leapfrog in. I think the the College Football Playoff Committee was setting up Iowa State maybe with a win to leapfrog Texas A&M into the top 4, depending on what happens with those top 4 teams. But I don't necessarily think it's going to work out for Oklahoma.
We shall see. In the Pac-12, it's going to be undefeated USC taking on Oregon. Oregon replacing Washington due to COVID issues in the Huskies program. The Trojans are 3-point favorites. The total sitting at 62.5. Brady, where's the moneymaker here?
Yeah, lay the points with USC. I mean, bottom line is this team's got arguably one of the best groups of wide receivers on the outside with Drake London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Tyler Vaughns. I mean, these guys are all legitimate playmakers. They're going to be tough to stop with Keaton Slovis. And this secondary for Oregon is not what we saw a year ago, where they were getting turnover after turnover and doing a better job of finding their football and getting hands-on footballs. Kayvon Thibodeau, too, hasn't been as productive rushing off the edge. Teams are giving him a lot more attention, and that's hurt them as well. So I think USC will put up a lot of points. Oregon will have a hard time keeping pace. They can run the football well for Dell and Dye, as well as Tyler Shuck. But bottom line is, they're in the first year of Joe Moorhead's system there at Oregon, and I just don't know that Shuck will have enough to be able to keep pace with this group. So I love USC here. I'll lay the 3 points.
I do too, Brady. I'm with you. I'm laying the field goal here with USC. I think the biggest mistake the Pac-12 made was not making a last-minute decision to do away the divisions and have USC play Colorado in this game. I think that would have been better for the conference. It would have been a better win for USC. I know the perception of Colorado isn't that great, but they only have 1 loss. Oregon comes in with 2 losses. The only thing that worries me somewhat is that USC was kind of having to prep for both Washington and Oregon. Oregon had their eyes all on USC, but ultimately, I don't think it matters. They haven't been running the ball as effectively in their last 2 losses. So I think they're going to try to get back to that. But clearly, they're still cutting their teeth somewhat in the shortened season, trying to work out Joe Moorhead's season. Tyler Shuck still trying to figure out kind of his way, and he's made some very first-year starter type mistakes. But ultimately, I'm with you. I think USC behind Keaton Slovis scores at will and comes out on top. Even though they've been flirting with fire a lot this season, I think they finally kind of figured out some of the issues they've dealt with, and they'll be on at full strength and come out on top.
Danny Kanell and Brady Quinn making all the right reads. Thank you, fellas. All right, let's take another look at those reads, how our guys are playing championship weekend. Some winning picks, both riding Bama. How could you not? Laying 17 against Florida. Notre Dame, both of our gentlemen saying it's the Irish covering the 10.5. Brady likes them to perhaps go outright. Danny said maybe a money line sprinkle as well. Northwestern and Ohio State, both guys not scared off by the 20.5 Ohio State is laying. In the Big 12, Oklahoma for Brady, Iowa State for Danny, and Oregon, USC, both guys riding SC, laying the 3.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.